Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium here at the Nebraska History Museum in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like this Brown Bag Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. Special thanks to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. If you enjoy today's programs and would like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, there are now over 70, please visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/History Nebraska. Our speaker today is Joe Starita, NU Professor of Journalism. Interested since his youth in Native American history and culture, Joe returned to his native Nebraska in 1992 to research and write The Dull Knives of Pine Ridge, a Lakota Odyssey. His second book is I Am a Man, Chief Standing Bear's Journey for Justice. In writing that book, he learned much about Susette LaFlesche. His newest book, A Warrior of the People, is a biography of Susette's younger sister, Susan LaFlesche. We will meet them today. 4 years ago, Joe established the Chief Standing Bear Journey for Justice Scholarship for Nebraska Native American high school graduates. To date, the scholarship has been awarded to 18 Native graduates of Nebraska high schools. Pictured here is Erin Rave, one of the 2018 scholarship winners from Omaha Nation High School in Macy. Erin will use her scholarship this fall to attend the Haskell's Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. Email Joe at jstarita2@unl.edu to learn more about this great idea. Our topic today is Susette and Susan LaFlesche, two sisters who helped change the face of Native America. Just to let you know about asking questions, Joe prefers you wait until the end to ask. Please join me in welcoming Joe Starita.
Thank you very much, John. And thank all of you for attending the talk today. I don't think authors in general are as gracious and as thankful as they should be when they get these opportunities. I want to make sure that that's not an issue with me. I am honored and privileged to be able to talk to you this afternoon for an hour or so about a topic that I am very passionate about. So my plan is to talk for about 45 minutes and then open it up to what I am going to predict will be a constellation of brilliant questions, insightful questions, and we will proceed on that basis. Do we have a deal? Yes, we got a deal. Okay, excellent. For many natives on the Great Plains of America, specifically Lakota, the year 1890 ended in horrific fashion. On the morning of December 29th, an unseasonably warm morning, a large village of Lakota were camped along Chankpay-Opi-Wakpala, along Wounded Knee Creek. Their village was surrounded by the remnants of Custer's 7th Cavalry. That morning, after a night of heavy drinking, the soldiers began a misguided attempt to disarm the village when a shot accidentally was fired. Instantly, a full barrage of Hotchkiss cannons opened fire, blowing much of the village and many of its people to pieces. Hours later, when it finally ended, the official Army report placed the number of Indian dead at 290, 90 warriors and 200 women and children. Later that afternoon, 18 miles to the southwest, in the ensuing panic, fear, and chaos, a 36-year-old woman stood alone on a wooden box in the village of Pine Ridge, yelling and screaming at the terrified women and children to run home, to run to their log cabins where the bullets could not penetrate. Later that night, as a numbing blizzard began to sweep across the Pine Ridge Reservation, she went to the Holy Episcopal Church, where the pews had been removed and beds of straw put down for the many dying and wounded who were laid out beneath a Christmas banner, peace on earth, goodwill to men. This woman went from one to the next, trying to comfort them, trying to feed a 5-year-old boy at one point soup and water, a mixture that poured out a hole in his neck because of the bullet that had pierced him. She kept at it all night, trying to comfort and bring goodwill to the very old and the very young gathered inside the Holy Episcopal Church. For much of the previous 11 years, this Omaha Indian woman had relentlessly crusaded for the one thing that consumed her: getting the United States government to bestow citizenship on the native people of America, giving them the right to vote on the lands that they had lived upon for thousands of years. To that end, she and her husband, Thomas Henry Tibbles, an irascible journalist for the Omaha World Herald, had stormed up and down the East Coast, from Boston to New York to Philadelphia to Washington, passionately advocating for Native citizenship rights. In the months before Chankpee Opi-Wakpala, she and Tibbles had brought their crusade overseas, recently wrapping up a year-long speaking tour in England and Scotland. The woman's name was Susette LaFlesche, who would become more popularly known as Bright Eyes. And she was the first Native American, male or female, in U.S. history to speak publicly, to speak passionately, to speak eloquently on behalf of Indian civil rights. That same year, 1890, there were 104,805 licensed physicians in the United States, only 4.4% of whom were women. And of that 4.4%, only one, just one, was a Native American woman. More than a year earlier, on March 14, 1889, this Omaha Indian woman had walked across the stage in Philadelphia and accepted her medical degree from the only college in the world at that time that trained women to become doctors. Born in a buffalo hide teepee in the waning weeks of the Civil War, she would graduate from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania 24 years later as the valedictorian of her class. And although she could now perform surgeries and conduct autopsies and treat tuberculosis, there were still two things that she could not do. Because she was a woman, she could not vote. That would take another 31 years. And because she was an Indian woman, she could not be considered a citizen in her own country. That would take another 35 years. So she did what she had vowed to do since she was 8 years old, when she had sat alone with an elderly Omaha woman in her home and watched this elderly Omaha woman die a horrifying, agonizing death, despite the fact that the white reservation doctor had been summoned 4 different times. She sat with the elderly woman and watched her die that morning, vowing she would do something to never let that happen again if she could. At age 24, Dr. Susan LaFlesche, the younger sister of Bright Eyes, had inherited 1,244 patients scattered across a 1,350 square mile reservation. And from her diaries, from her journals, from her hundreds of letters, you can piece together the extraordinary effort that she made to fulfill that vow that she had made to herself as an 8-year-old girl watching that elderly Omaha woman die. Dr. Susan LaFlesche, at age 24, would typically get up at 5 o'clock in the morning in January of 1891. 22 below zero. I know it was 22 below zero because she wrote that in her diary. And she would get up at 5 a.m. at age 24 with 1,244 patients. 5 a.m., 2 feet of snow often covering this massive reservation. And she would walk 50 or 60 yards to the barn where she would hitch up her 2 favorite chocolate mares, Pat and Pudge, to her buggy, throw a buffalo robe over her shoulders, and begin fanning out in the dark, in the cold, in 2 feet of snow, desperately trying to find a location that a distant relative had given her some days earlier. This was before Google Maps. So she was told to go 3 miles north on Omaha Creek, and there would be a large cottonwood tree. And at that large cottonwood tree, turn left and go west a mile, and then go north another 3/4 of a mile. And at that point, you should see a log cabin with a plume of smoke coming out. And inside that log cabin, there was a 14-year-old girl curled up in a fetal position on the corner on a dirt floor, dying of tuberculosis. And the only thing standing between this 14-year-old girl and death was Dr. Susan LaFlesche. And she would do this morning after morning, day after day, year after year, sometimes not returning home until after 10 o'clock at night, sometimes ending her diary entries, went to bed after 11, supperless, too tired to eat. She would get up and do it again the next morning. Where does this kind of courage come from? Where does this kind of determination come from? How did these two girls, how did these two sisters, separated by 11 years, emerge from the same family in the last quarter of the 19th century and conquer a Native American landscape awash in starvation, isolation, land theft, disease, alcoholism, massacres? How did these two girls from the same family manage to overcome the enormous hurdles and the enormous barriers that had been placed before them? How did they manage to do that and become the nation's first Native American civil rights crusader and America's first Native doctor, male or female? To understand and comprehend the extraordinary trajectory of their lives, to comprehend and understand the remarkable achievements that two sisters, one the youngest and one the oldest in this family of 4 girls, to understand how they were able to pull that off, it's necessary to understand their father, Joseph LaFlesche. The question posed was, how on earth did these two sisters in the same family, the oldest and the youngest of 4 girls, manage to overcome all of the extraordinary racial and gender hurdles in front of them? And in seeking an answer to that very basic fundamental question, you have to go to the headwaters. And the headwaters in this case was their father, Joseph LaFlesche, often regarded as the last chief of the Omaha tribe. In Nebraska, the 100th meridian essentially cuts the state in half. The 100th meridian goes right down the middle of Nebraska, creating an eastern half and a western half. And west of the 100th meridian, all life over millennia has evolved to adapt or perish. Because west of the 100th meridian, there is typically an annual rainfall of less than 24 inches. So in order to survive, the plant life and the animal life in these semi-arid regions had to adapt or perish. So the root systems of many of the plants west of the 100th meridian spread out horizontally close to the surface so it could absorb the spare moisture as soon as it would fall. Other plants would grow a deep vertical root sinking far into the soil to absorb moisture. That's how those plants survived. The pronghorn antelope out north of Scotts Bluff on the high plains evolved to have this extraordinary peripheral vision and ears that would rotate, that can rotate, like military surveillance aircraft, so that those ears can detect the sound of a blade of grass snapping 100 feet behind them, a blade of grass snapped by a coyote making its way up from behind them. Those plants and those animals had to learn how to adapt in order to survive. And Joseph LaFlesche understood exactly what had happened west of the 100th meridian, that in order for his beloved Omaha Indian people to survive, they would have to adapt or perish. All of the chiefs in the American West in the last half of the 19th century faced the same fork in the road. We can go left and retain our cultural traditions, our ceremonies, our songs, our dress, our language, and try and live like we have for thousands of years. Or we can turn right and try and assimilate and try and integrate the best of white culture and white civilization into the cultural fabric that has sustained us for millennia. And this was a very difficult decision because many of the Omaha people did not want to assimilate. They wanted nothing to do with the white man who had killed their buffalo, who had stolen their land, who had given them smallpox and tuberculosis. We want nothing to do with them. Joseph LaFlesche saw it much differently. He saw and he believed that the only way his people and his children would be able to survive is if they took the best of white culture and married it to the best of Omaha culture. Born about 1818 in the northeast corner of Nebraska, Joseph LaFlesche was one of this new group of mixed blood people who were springing up around the trading posts. He was the son of a French fur trader and a Native American woman. He went with his father, the French fur trader, many times up and down the Missouri River to St. Louis, the center of the fur trading industry in the early quarter of the 19th century. And he saw the great city of St. Louis. He saw the sheer number of white people. He saw their buildings. He saw their ships. He saw their bustling commerce. And it had an indelible mark on him. When he would get back to the trading posts where he grew up outside of Omaha, along the Missouri River, he saw the great influences that were coming up that river. So he would spend many, many years and hours and months with his French fur trading father, and he would spend many, many hours and weeks and months with his native people. And he learned all of their traditions, and he learned all of their cultures. He spoke 5 languages fluently. And he began to adopt the same vision of the Omaha's great chief at the time, Big Elk. And when Big Elk was near death in 1853, he avoided tribal tradition because he was so enamored of how closely Joseph LaFlesche's vision of assimilation matched his own, that he essentially anointed Joseph, who was not next in line from a blood standpoint, from a hereditary standpoint. But he thought the only way the Omaha could survive is he jumped out of the tradition and didn't follow the bloodline and appointed Joseph LaFlesche as the keeper of his vision. as the new chief of the Omaha Indian people. A very controversial decision. This split the tribe in half because Joseph was wedded to the idea of assimilate or extinction. So half of the tribe, the traditionalists, wanted nothing to do with Joseph. But Joseph was set in his vision, and he began to mold the progressive wing of the tribe into the vision that Big Elk had, into the vision that he had. He sawed logs. He got a sawmill. He got carpenters. He built what many regard as the first two-story wood frame house of a Native American west of the Missouri River. He took 100 acres and subdivided it into plots and gave all the people who were following him their individual land to farm. He wanted them to learn about Christianity. He wanted them to learn the English language. And in his own household, he was resolute in raising his children to believe that the only way they could cross over this bridge from the old way of life to the new way of life is if they did adopt and integrate the best of white civilization with the best of Omaha Indian culture. And so Joseph LaFlesche had very strict rules. He was the first chief in the history of the Omaha tribe not to allow his children to have the mark of honor. A tattoo, often on the neck, a sunburst or a four-pointed star, often on the neck or the forehead. A tattoo, a mark of honor that had been with the Omaha people for as long as they had roamed the earth, and that mark of honor designated them as the son or daughter of a chief or an important member of the tribe. He would not allow any of his children to have the mark of honor because he believed that tattoo, that sunburst on their forehead, that four-pointed star on their neck would somehow compromise their ability to assimilate, their ability to achieve everything he wanted them to achieve. He would not allow his children to pierce their, he sounds like me. He wouldn't allow his children to pierce their ears or get tatted up. In his household, he would not allow his 4 daughters, when they were talking among themselves, to speak the Omaha language, or to speak the Ponca language, or to speak French, or to speak Oto, which all 4 of these girls knew. When they were speaking among themselves in this 2-story wood frame house on the Omaha reservation, they could only speak English. They could only speak English. Joseph LaFlesche and his wife, a very powerful woman, the daughter of a powerful Iowa Indian chief and a white U.S. Army surgeon, she kept the cultural flame going in the household. She taught her daughters about Omaha tradition. She taught them how to quilt, how to sew, how to plant certain herbs and certain plants for medicinal reasons. She taught them the Omaha stories and legends on cold winter nights. So it was up to Mary Gale to nurture that part of Bright Eyes and that part of Dr. Susan. But it was Joseph who insisted, with all of his children, that the key to the castle was education. And in that vein, he sent his oldest daughter, Bright Eyes, off to a private girls' school, the Elizabeth Institute for Young Girls in Elizabeth, New Jersey, when she was only 14 years old. And she spent 6 years. And you try and imagine if you were to send your daughters or granddaughters right now at age 14, put them on a train and send them to Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is a scary place to begin with. But for an American Indian chief in the 1860s to send their 14-year-old daughter alone on a train to Elizabeth, New Jersey, where she would spend 6 years loving every minute of it because she loved studying, she loved math, she loved science, and what she loved above all else was literature this 14-year-old Omaha Indian girl, the first Native civil rights champion, Bright Eyes, devoured Shakespeare in Elizabeth, New Jersey in the 1860s. Her particular favorite, King Lear. I'm guessing that was a very small subset of 15-year-old Native American girls who adored King Lear in the 1860s. Bright Eyes did. And after 6 years, Bright Eyes came back to the Omaha Reservation. And she had one obsessive goal that was her Moby Dick. What Bright Eyes wanted to do after 6 years of math and science, of seeing all of the white man's cities and bustling streets and markets, of learning to love Shakespeare and King Lear, she came back on a train 6 years later with one goal. Bright Eyes, the eldest daughter of Joseph LaFlesche and Mary Gale, wanted to become the first Omaha Indian teacher in the history of the reservation. She wanted to teach the children so many of the things that she had learned when she was away at the white man's school in Elizabeth, New Jersey. But the government did not want her to become the first Omaha Indian teacher on the reservation. And they set up obstacle after obstacle, roadblock after roadblock. And I think the easiest thing for me to do at this point is simply to read, with your permission, a passage out of my book that encapsulates what this very determined, you talk about the acorn not falling far from the tree, this very determined young lady, how she was going to become the first teacher no matter how many roadblocks were set up. Do I have your permission to read this page? You are so gracious. I thank you. All along, the oldest sister's childhood dream had been to teach Omaha children in their own school on their own reservation. So she spent 6 long years, from the fall of 1869 to the summer of 1875, at the Elizabeth Institute for Young Ladies in Elizabeth, New Jersey, working hard, getting good grades, devouring Shakespeare, teaching part-time to help pay for her education. After graduating from the boarding school in June of 1875, Bright Eyes returned home and was told she could not teach on the reservation. But one day, at the agency office, she found a copy of the rules and regulations governing reservation employment. In one section, she noticed it said Indians should be the preferred teachers. So she dashed off a letter to Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Q. Smith, saying she was qualified and would like to apply for a teaching position at her reservation school. The commissioner told her she could not teach without a certificate, so she asked the Omaha agent for permission to leave the reservation. To take the exam for her teaching certificate. The white agent refused to give her permission, so she got one of her father's best horses and rode 28 miles to Tacoma, where she asked the superintendent of schools to give her the exam. He gave her the hardest reading and arithmetic section, but she passed anyway, got the certificate, and rode back home. She sent the certificate to the Indian commissioner, who told her she couldn't teach without a certificate of good moral character. So she wrote Miss Nettie Reed, one of her teachers at the New Jersey school, who sent a number of letters attesting to her good moral character. She then sent the letter to the commissioner and heard nothing for several months. So she wrote him again saying she would take her story to the newspapers if he didn't respond. This was before fake news. Not long after, the commissioner approved her position, and Bright Eyes became the first Indian teacher in the history of the Omaha Reservation. The government gave her a small, dilapidated building and $20 a month. She gathered some children, scrimped and saved, and eventually bought a small organ to teach them music, then started a Sunday school for the children. The government's official census rolls back then identified the 21-year-old teacher as Susette LaFlesche. But in a few years, she would be known to many whites, from Chicago to Boston, New York to Washington, London to Scotland, simply as Bright Eyes. So by the fall of 1875, the year Mark Twain published Tom Sawyer, Bright Eyes was living her dream on her reservation homeland. She was teaching her people, young Omaha boys and girls, what they would need to know to survive in the world beyond the village of the make-believe white man, which is what the traditionalists opposed to Joseph called his village. She had her own little house now, a small classroom, a small government paycheck, a used organ for music lessons, and her Sunday school classes every week. And she had something else. That fall, her 3 younger sisters all moved in with her. They were all going to the same Presbyterian mission school where Bright Eyes taught, so their father thought it best that all 4 daughters live together near their school and help one another out, with Bright Eyes acting as the head of the household. So now all 4 of the girls were under the command of Bright Eyes, and from Susan's recollection, her older sister was a very tough taskmaster. She would not allow them to speak anything but English in the home. She assigned each of them specific chores. Some had to cut wood, some had to get water, and Susan's job at every meal was to beat egg whites until she later recalled that she could never look at an egg again as a result of her taskmaster older sister and the way that she was raised. The 4 girls were all living in Bright Eyes' house on the Omaha Reservation in the early spring of 1879, in March of 1879, when a middle-aged chief from another tribe, a tribe that was almost like cousins to the Omaha, arrived on the Omaha Reservation, arrived at Joseph LaFlesche's house. This middle-aged chief and 750 of his people in the spring of 1877 had been physically torn from their beloved homeland along the Niobrara River and forcibly marched 550 miles south and deposited on the scorching plains of northern Oklahoma with no food, no housing provisions, nothing. Just forcibly marched 550 miles and dumped on the lands of Oklahoma, where within 1 year, 1/3 of the Ponca people had died of malaria. And on Christmas week of 1878, Standing Bear's only son, a 14-year-old boy by the name of Bearshield, lay near death on the bottom of a cheap Army canvas tent in north central Oklahoma. But before the boy's eyes closed in death, he begged his father, the chief, to return his body to their sacred homeland along the Niobrara River. So about 1 o'clock on the afternoon of January 1st, 1879, Standing Bear and 29 others, with the temperature 19 below zero, a raging blizzard coming in from Canada, with no food, with no winter clothing, with no money, began walking from Oklahoma to near the South Dakota border in order to honor the deathbed pledge Standing Bear had given his only son. In January of 1879, the government of the United States had entered into 376 treaties with the native people of America, and they had broken all 376. But Standing Bear was not going to break the promise that he had made his son. So they set out on that day in early January 1879 19 below zero. They would rummage for field corn by day and tunnel into haystacks at night, putting the elderly and the young inside these tunnels to keep them from freezing to death. 1 day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time, until finally, in late March, they arrived among their relatives, their friends, their tribal cousins on the Omaha Reservation, to Joseph LaFlesche's house, where they met Bright Eyes, where they met the young Susan LaFlesche. And before long, word got out that this band of Ponca had illegally left their reservation and were camped on the Omaha Reservation, at which point Brigadier General George Crook, the highest-ranking military officer west of the Mississippi, ordered their arrest and marched to Fort Omaha, which happened, and set in motion a landmark civil rights trial that occurred in May of 1879 on the 3rd floor of a monolithic yellow brick courthouse on the corner of 15th and Dodge Streets, when a federal judge heard Standing Bear's case against the government of the United States. His story, written about passionately by Thomas Henry Tibbles, the irascible journalist from the Omaha World Herald, got the attention of Omaha's 2 most prominent lawyers, who were intrigued by the idea of an American Indian chief suing the government of the United States for his freedom. So they agreed to represent Standing Bear for free. And on the afternoon of May 2nd, 1879, Standing Bear, who had sued Brigadier General George Crook for illegally arresting him, for illegally detaining him, for preventing him from honoring the deathbed pledge he had given his son, took the witness stand. And the interpreter for all of Standing Bear's remarks inside this packed courthouse, all of Standing Bear's words were conveyed to the judge, to all of the people inside the courthouse at 15th and Dodge Streets, by Joseph LaFlesche's oldest daughter, by Bright Eyes. When Standing Bear took the stand, he raised his hand and said, "That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you also will feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be of the same color as yours. I am a man. The same God made us both." Those were words that were conveyed to everyone in this packed courthouse by Bright Eyes. And it began her transformation from Omaha Reservation school teacher to eventually a national icon on behalf of Indian civil rights. So in the fall of 1879, 2 trains left Omaha headed for the East Coast. One was a train in which these 4 people were traveling on. Bright Eyes, who you see in the photo, her husband, Thomas Henry Tibbles, her half-brother, Francis LaFlesche, who became the first Indian ethnographer in the history of the United States. These 4, and Chief Standing Bear, these 4 all began leaving Omaha in the fall of 1879 on an extended East Coast speaking tour in which Bright Eyes became a star. On another train, leaving the same fall, was a 14-year-old girl, her youngest sister, who was headed to the same Elizabeth, New Jersey school as her older sister had attended. And so Susan LaFlesche would spend 2 years at the Elizabeth School for Young Ladies, where she also became enamored of studying, of absorbing information, of trying to absorb the ways of the white people and try and figure out how they could be incorporated into her own Indian world. And then she went to Hampton University after that, where she studied for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, she graduated number 2 in her class. And after that, through the help of 3 powerful white women who had spent time with her and who could not believe how smart she was, how determined she was, how focused she was, how desperately she wanted to be a doctor. These 3 white women formed a flying wedge around Susan LaFlesche, and they got her in to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And in order to understand the magnitude of this woman's achievement, in order to understand what it would have been like for an Omaha Indian girl in the last quarter of the 19th century to become a doctor, it's important to understand where the bar had been set by an entrenched white Christian male establishment that ruled all aspects of American culture and society at the end of the 19th century. To give you a specific idea of the current that Susan was swimming against, it was the prevailing belief among the dominant culture's power structure in 1880s, in 1870s, into the 1890s, that women should not be allowed to go to college, that women should not be allowed to attend a university, because the stress of college life, the stress of attending a university, would destroy a woman's reproductive organs, rendering her infertile, thereby threatening the very existence of mankind. And these theories were not proposed by the ideological cave dwellers of the era. They were proposed by the Stephen Hawkings of the era. And I don't want you to take my word for this. So if I can once again ask for your permission to read a couple of paragraphs from the leading scientific journals of the era, you will understand the historical antecedent that is necessary to comprehend just what an achievement Susan was on the verge of. And again, I ask, do I have your permission? Let me just read a couple of paragraphs. These are excerpts from some of the most powerful and popular scientific journals of the era. Just therefore, as higher civilization is heralded, or at least evidenced by increasing bulk of brain, just as the most intelligent and the dominant races surpass their rivals in cranial capacity, and just as in those races the leaders, where in the sphere of thought or of action are eminently large-brained, so we must naturally expect that man, surpassing woman in volume of brain, must surpass her in at least a proportionate degree in intellectual power. So proclaimed the December 1878 issue of Popular Science Monthly. But not to be outdone, on the other side of the pond, the Journal of the Anthropological Society of London was even more specific. And I quote, "During menstruation, women suffer under a languor and depression which disqualify them from thought or action, and render it extremely doubtful how far they can be considered responsible human beings while the crisis endures. In intellectual labor, man has surpassed, does now, and always will surpass woman, for the obvious reason that nature does not periodically interrupt his thought or activities." End quote. Those are the waters Susan was swimming in. And yet, she was able, through the help of women, to get into the only college in the world that you could walk in the front door and 3 years later walk out the back door with a medical degree. So she had classmates from Damascus, Syria, from Tokyo, Japan, from New Delhi, India, who had flocked in from all over the world to become doctors, to go back to their respective homes and neighborhoods and communities and try and make life better. One of the things that I love so much about the stories of these two remarkable women is the much different view that it gives us of this magnificent place called the American West. A place that we all know because we live in it. A place that is universally known throughout the world because of dime store novels, because of Buffalo Bill Cody, because of television programs, because of movies. But when we walk up those steps and we get to the top step and we look out the window and we have this panoramic sweep of the American West, that view of the American West forever was refracted exclusively through the lens of men. We have come to know about the American West because of Crazy Horse and Custer, because of Geronimo, because of Sitting Bull, because of Buffalo Bill Cody, because of Marshall Dillon, because of Paladin, because of the Cartwrights. The editor for this book is a German woman. She works for St. Martin's Press, top 2 floors of the Flatiron Building in New York, that iconic triangular-shaped building, the corner of 23rd and 5th Avenue that I'm sure many of you have seen or know about. St. Martin's Press occupies the top 2 floors. The editor of this book and my book on Chief Standing Bearer is Daniela Rapp, born and raised in Stuttgart, Germany. Went to see her because I look for excuses as often as possible just to get into the Flatiron Building because I love it so much. And one August day, I manufactured some reason to see her, and she was telling me about growing up in Stuttgart, Germany, and how she had fallen in love with the American West. And that's how she ended up in New York on the 15th floor of the Flatiron Building as the Western History Acquisitions editor for St. Martin's Press. This love affair with the American West that began as a 14-year-old in Stuttgart, Germany, when she would watch Gunsmoke on German television. And they didn't use, they dubbed. They didn't use subtitles, Daniela was saying. They dubbed into German what Marshall Dillon was saying. She loved Gunsmoke, she loved Paladin, but her favorite American TV show as a 14-year-old girl in Germany was Bonanza. And she told me that on this sultry afternoon on the 15th floor of St. Martin's Press, and I was just dumbstruck by the idea of walking into a German home, walking into the living room, seeing the television on in one corner, and seeing Haas Cartwright speaking fluent High German. Because my recollection of Haas is very clear that he struggled mightily with English. So, one of the things I love about talking and writing about these two remarkable sisters from the same family is how much different that view is when we get to the top step and look out at the American West through the eyes of Bright Eyes, through the eyes of Susan LaFlesche, because that view becomes much more complicated. That landscape is much more emotionally complex. Susan would be alone in that buggy at 5 a.m., 19 below zero, 2 feet of snow, desperately looking for that plume of smoke and that 14-year-old girl, morning after morning after morning, and sometime all alone on that frozen black cold prairie, she would have these paralyzing panic attacks. And she would wonder, am I going to die all alone? Am I going to die without ever having children, which was the strongest self-identifying characteristic of an Omaha Indian woman? Am I going to die without ever having a husband, a family, children? You don't see that coming through with Custer and Crazy Horse. I have never come across anything that said Crazy Horse was paralyzed with the idea that he wouldn't have children or wouldn't have a family. Maybe he was, but we know for a fact Susan was, but she wrote about it. She wrote about it. And then she did ultimately have a husband and had 2 beautiful sons And she was still the doctor for 1,244 people. And she had this conflict because when she was out making house calls, she felt like she was a great doctor, but a horrible mother. She had left her 2 young, adorable boys, Carol and Pierre, home. So then she would be overcome with guilt and stay home with her 2 adorable young boys. She felt like a great mother, but a horrible doctor. And she had nobody to turn to. She couldn't hop online and check in with others about how they balanced family and career. She couldn't talk to anybody else because there was nobody else who was in her position. Thankfully, in the opening years of the 21st century, we have now solved that problem. We no longer have to struggle or worry about having to balance family and career. That's sarcasm, by the way. So I'm going to say this, that if we were to just establish a metaphorical history table of Nebraska heroes in this room right now, right here, we're going to have a metaphorical table of Nebraska history heroes, right here. And I give each of you a ballot, and I ask you to tell me who are the 5 people that you would put at our metaphorical history table of Nebraska heroes. And then I'm going to collect all your ballots, and then I'm going to tabulate them. And I'm guessing, wild guesses, that Willa Cather is going to have a seat at that table. That William Jennings Bryan is going to have a seat at that table. That George Norris is going to have a seat at that table. Standing Bear is going to have a seat at that table. Johnny Carson might have a seat at that table. Tom Osborne, I'm pretty sure, would have a seat at that table. And I'm just saying, it would not bother me in any way, shape, or form. It would not confuse me or shame me in any way, shape, or form if we as Nebraskans approached that table of Nebraska history heroes and we saw 2 empty chairs with brass nameplates above those chairs that said reserved for Susette LaFlesche, reserved for Dr. Susan LaFlesche. Thank you very much. I believe I have fulfilled my obligations, and now I believe, according to our agreement, we have time for a couple of comments or questions. Yes, ma'am.
I am just wondering how you came across their diaries and where you found them, when they started keeping records, writing them.
The question is, how and when did I come across the diaries and some of the primary source documents that I used as the literary DNA to shape these stories? I was blessed to have a woman like Dr. Susan LaFlesche, who was completely literate and who had spent so much time on the East Coast and was so homesick during all those years in New Jersey and Hampton, Virginia, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the only way she could figure out to collapse that 1,400 miles between the East Coast and her beloved homeland was to do an all-out assault on the U.S. Postal Office. It was not unusual for her to write 10 or 12 letters a week. In fact, that was quite common. She was an avid diary person, a journal person. There is an enormous cache, 4 different places those documents came from. There's an enormous cache of those documents at the State Historical Society, right here, under LaFlesche Family Papers. There's another valuable cache now at Drexel University, because the Women's Medical College no longer exists. Drexel University. I can tell you, if you give me the month and the year, I can tell you which classes Susan was taking and what she got for a grade in chemistry. Because Drexel University has her records. Hampton University kept files on all of its students. I have access to all those files. One of the 3 women benefactors of Susan was this powerful Hartford, Connecticut woman, Sarah Thompson Kinney, who had voluminous conversations and letters exchanged, and all of those are at the Hartford Public Library. So that's what I do. I was an investigative reporter in Miami and New York for years, and that's what I do. I gather documents. And I am so madly in love with these 2 that I would go to the ends of the earth. And if I don't have every scrap of paper with Susan's name on it, I should burn in hell. And maybe I will, who knows. But I think we have reached the end of our time here. And I just want to say again how much I appreciate you coming on this lovely spring afternoon. And hopefully the trade-off was worth it. Thank you all very much.